I was standing in a parking lot behind a church, holding everything I owned in 2 grocery bags, when my uncle called to tell me the will was settled. "There wasn't anything set aside for you, Marlowe," Holt said. Flat. The same voice he used to announce weather delays at his hardware store. "I know that's hard to hear. But Dad's estate is settled now." I didn't cry. Before he hung up, Holt asked, almost as an afterthought, whether Grandpa had ever said anything to me about the old trailer out on the back lot. I told him no, and asked why. There was a pause on the line, longer than the question deserved. "No reason," he said. "Just settling things." Then he changed the subject to when I'd come by to sign some paperwork, and I let it go, because I had bigger things to sit with than my uncle's odd tone about a trailer nobody wanted. I said okay. I said thank you for telling me. Then I hung up and sat down on the curb, because my legs had stopped agreeing to hold me up. 3 weeks earlier, my grandfather, June Bennett, had died in his sleep at 81. He was the only steady thing I'd ever had. My mother had moved out of state with a boyfriend I'd met twice. My lease had ended the same month rent went up. I'd been sleeping on a friend's couch until her landlord noticed extra dishes in the sink. So there I was. 20 years old. Everything I owned fitting into 2 grocery bags. Believing the one person who might have left me something had left me nothing at all. I want to tell you I was wrong about that. But it took a broken trailer, a hidden letter, and a secret my family had buried for 40 years before I understood exactly how wrong I was. Grandpa Elias had raised me more than my own parents ever managed to. When I was 7 and my mother forgot to pick me up from school for the 3rd time that month, he was the one who showed up in his old pickup, heater blasting, telling me I never had to wonder whether someone was coming for me as long as he was alive. When I turned 16 and everyone else in the family had opinions about what I should become, he was the only one who asked what I actually wanted, and waited long enough to hear the answer. So when Holt told me the estate was settled and there was nothing in it with my name on it, I believed the worst possible version of that sentence. I believed it meant Grandpa hadn't thought of me at all in his final years. That whatever love I remembered had quietly stopped counting once the paperwork got written. It took me a long time to understand that Holt hadn't exactly lied to me. He'd just left out the one thing that didn't fit the story my family wanted to tell. 2 days after that phone call, my Aunt Corinne reached out about something different. An old travel trailer Grandpa had kept on a back lot outside town. Nobody had touched it in years. "It's specifically yours," she said. "Separate from everything else in the will." Then, quieter, like she was managing my expectations before I even got there, "It's not worth anything, Marlowe. Dad let that thing rot for a decade." I went anyway. A broken trailer with my name on it was still more than the nothing I'd been told I had. Corinne met me on the lot, arms crossed against the cold. "I really do think you'd be better off letting the scrapyard take it," she said. "Not unkind. Just tired. Nobody would blame you for walking away from this." "I don't have anywhere else to walk to," I told her. Something in her face flickered when I said that. Like she hadn't let herself think about that part of it until I made her. The trailer looked like it had been abandoned mid-argument with time. Rust bleeding down every seam. One window boarded so long the plywood had gone soft and gray. When I pushed the door open, the smell of stale water hit me before my eyes even adjusted. My cousin Garrett had driven out to make sure I actually took it. He stood in the doorway, laughing under his breath. "This is what Grandpa left you," he said. Not really a question. "Guess that tells you where you actually stood with him." I didn't answer him. There was no version of an answer that would satisfy Garrett. That night, with nowhere else to sleep, I stayed in the trailer. The roof leaked in 3 places during the first storm. I spent hours shifting a bucket between them, and somewhere around 3 in the morning, soaked and shaking, I let myself believe, just for a little while, that Garrett had been right. That this leaking box was exactly what I was worth to my family. I opened my phone to call my mother. Got as far as her name on the screen. Then I put it away, because I already knew how that conversation would go. By morning, the storm had passed. Something stubborn in me had decided that leaving would mean letting Garrett's laugh be the last word on what I was worth. I stayed. And that's when I noticed it. A section of the floor near the back that sounded wrong every time I shifted my weight. Hollow. I was too tired that first night to do anything but note it. But the sound stayed with me the way an unanswered question does. In the morning, I pried up the panel with a screwdriver from the kitchen drawer. Underneath it, cut directly into the subfloor, was a metal box. Inside it, one sealed envelope. My name written across the front in handwriting I would have known anywhere. Grandpa's handwriting. My hands were shaking before I even got the seal open. Marlowe, if you're reading this, it means you found the one thing in this family nobody thought was worth looking at twice. That should tell you something about how this family decides what has value. I read those 2 sentences 4 or 5 times before I could keep going. He wrote that he couldn't leave me money outright. Not without it being pulled apart by people who'd never once asked what I needed, only what they were owed. Anything with a $sign attached to it in our family, he said, got fought over before it could do anyone any good. So instead, he'd left me something nobody else had bothered to remember existed at all. He told me to look for an old road. One I wouldn't find on any current map. Journey Creek Lane, out past the quarry turn nobody used anymore. There was a cabin at the end of it, he wrote. It had belonged to our family for decades. Whatever I found there would explain more than he'd had the courage to say to my face while he was alive. That was the whole letter. No promise of money. Just a road and a warning that once I understood what was out there, I wouldn't be able to see my family the same way again. I sat on that ruined floor for a long time after I finished reading. I thought about the spring I turned 18, telling Grandpa I was scared I'd never build a life that looked like anything, given where I'd started. He'd been on his porch, hands wrapped around a coffee mug gone cold. The people who end up building the most meaningful things, he'd told me, are almost always the ones who spent years being told they weren't worth building anything for. I'd assumed that was just something grandfathers say. I didn't realize until that morning, holding his letter in a trailer he'd left me on purpose, that he might have been speaking from more direct experience than I understood. I hadn't been at his bedside when he died. Nobody had called me in time. I'd carried a quiet guilt about that for 3 weeks, a feeling I'd failed some final duty I never got the chance to fulfill. Sitting there, I started to understand something else instead. He hadn't needed me there at the very end to know how much I meant to him. He'd already spent years making sure of that. In the only way he trusted to actually last. I drove out to Journey Creek Lane the next morning on fumes and stubbornness. An old man at the gas station remembered the road existed but couldn't say for certain the cabin was still standing. The road went to gravel, then to packed dirt, narrow enough that branches scraped both sides of my car. No houses. No mailboxes. Nothing to suggest anyone had lived out this way in decades. More than once I nearly turned around. Then, set back behind a stand of overgrown pines, small and weathered, it was still there. A padlock on the door. Newer than everything else about the place. Like someone had been maintaining just that one thing long after they'd stopped caring about anything else. The key was in the same metal box, wrapped in a handkerchief I hadn't noticed the first time through. It turned in the lock like it had been waiting for me specifically. Inside was one room. A stone fireplace. Furniture under dust cloths gone gray with age. A row of photograph albums on a shelf. A stack of papers on a desk, held down by a rock, like someone had left in a hurry decades ago and never come back to finish putting things away. The first album I opened stopped me cold. A young woman, 18 or 19, standing in front of that same cabin. Smiling in a way that looked exactly like my own smile in photographs my friends had taken of me. I didn't recognize her. I turned the photograph over. One name, written in handwriting that wasn't Grandpa's. June Bennett. I had never once heard that name spoken in my entire life. Not at Christmas. Not at the funeral 3 weeks earlier, where relatives I barely recognized had stood around swapping stories about Grandpa's whole life like they'd actually known all of it. Not once, in 20 years of holidays and Sunday dinners and the slow, ordinary accumulation of family history that's supposed to tell you who you come from. A whole person, erased that completely, that quietly. I sat down on the dusty floor of that cabin holding her photograph, and for a moment I forgot entirely about the trailer, the will, Holt's phone call, all of it. There was just her face, smiling at whoever had held the camera, in front of a cabin that had apparently been keeping her secret for longer than I'd been alive. I kept going through the album. The further in I went, the fewer photographs there were. A handful from her teenage years. Laughing at some family gathering I didn't recognize. Standing beside a much younger grandpa in front of what had to be the original family farmhouse. Then, abruptly, nothing. No wedding. No later years. No photographs of her growing older at all. Like her whole recorded existence had simply stopped sometime in her late teens and never resumed. That gap told me more than any single photograph could have. Whatever had happened to June, it had happened suddenly. And it had been thorough. I sat with the album in my lap for a long time before I could make myself open the desk drawer. It stuck badly. I had to work it loose with both hands. Inside was a second envelope, already opened, addressed in the same unfamiliar handwriting from the back of the photograph. A letter June herself had started writing and never finished. Dated the year she would have been 19. She wrote about counting the days between visits from her brother. About a town 10 miles away she was no longer welcome to set foot in. About wondering whether being remembered by even one person was enough to call a life worth living. I had to set it down twice before I could keep reading. I thought about my own mother, who called twice a month if I was lucky. I thought about how loud silence can get when it's been going on long enough. I thought about June, alone in this same room, asking herself the exact question I'd asked myself on the curb behind that church. Am I worth anything to the people who are supposed to love me? I didn't have an answer for her. I'm not sure she ever got one either. But something in me sat a little straighter, reading her words, like I'd just met someone who understood a version of loneliness I'd never had to explain out loud before. I spent the rest of that afternoon piecing together what I could from the papers on the desk. June had been Grandpa's younger sister. Born nearly 15 years after him, back when my great-grandparents still ran the family farm the Bennetts had held for 3 generations. A folded letter near the bottom of the stack told me the rest, in the careful, formal language people used to describe things they didn't want to say plainly. June had gotten pregnant at 17. Unmarried. In a town and a decade that treated that fact as a permanent stain rather than a private hardship. Her parents sent her away to this cabin. Out past the quarry. Far enough from town that nobody would have to look at her. Grandpa, only in his early 30s then, had been the one who kept driving out to check on her. According to a second letter, this one in June's own hand and never sent, their parents told the rest of the family and most of the town that June had moved away for good. Cut off all contact. In truth, she had stayed within 10 miles of the family farm for the rest of her life. Quietly erased from every conversation. Every holiday. Every mention of who the Bennetts actually were. I sat with that for a long time. I kept thinking about Corrine calling the trailer worthless before she'd even seen inside it. About how quickly my family decided what deserved to be kept and what didn't. I was starting to understand it wasn't the first time. I thought about the version of my own life that had gone quiet, too, in smaller ways. The friends who stopped asking how I was doing once, still figuring it out, became my permanent answer. The way my mother's calls had thinned from weekly to occasional to whenever something reminded her I existed. I hadn't been sent away to a cabin behind a quarry. But I understood, sitting there in June's dust and silence, what it felt like to watch people quietly decide you required less of their attention than you used to. Grandpa had never let me become that to him. Not once, in 20 years. I was only starting to understand what it must have cost him to be that person for June, too, while the rest of the family pretended there was nothing left to protect. Further down in the stack, I found a short, formal letter from an adoption agency 2 counties over. Dated the same year June would have given birth. It confirmed, in the clipped language of the era, that a healthy baby girl had been placed with a family through a closed arrangement, at the request of the birth mother's parents. No name for the child. No way to trace her further. Just a case number and a signature. I sat with that letter longer than any of the others. Somewhere out there was a whole branch of my family erased even more completely than June had been. A cousin, or an aunt, I would probably never be able to find. And I understood, sitting there, that Grandpa had likely spent years quietly searching for that same answer without ever getting one. Near the very bottom of the stack, I found something else. A short note in Grandpa's handwriting, dated only a few years back. Far more recent than everything around it. If Holt finds this before Marlowe does, he will try to make it disappear again. Don't let him. I read it twice, sitting on the floor of that cabin, and something cold settled in my stomach. I thought about a conversation I'd almost forgotten. 2 Thanksgivings ago, Holt had gone quiet when Grandpa mentioned, offhand, that he still drove out past the quarry sometimes to check on old family land. Holt had changed the subject fast. Asked if anyone wanted more potatoes. I hadn't thought anything of it at the time. I thought about it differently now. I brought what I'd found back into town 2 days later. I needed someone who might actually know something, and Holt was the only relative I trusted enough to ask directly. His face changed the moment I said June's name. "Where did you hear that name?" he said. It wasn't really a question. "There's a cabin," I said. "Out past the quarry, on Journey Creek Lane. Grandpa left me a letter that led me there." He set down the clipboard he'd been holding and didn't say anything for a long moment. A customer came in looking for deck screws. He handled the sale with a steadiness that struck me as strange, given how pale he'd gone. When the store was empty again, he came around the counter and lowered his voice, like the shelves themselves might be listening. "That land's not part of any will," he said finally. "It was never supposed to matter to anyone still living." "It mattered enough for him to keep paying to maintain it for 40 years, I said. "Why does that scare you so much?" "It doesn't scare me," he said. Too quickly. We both heard how untrue that sounded the moment it left his mouth. He didn't answer directly. But something in his face told me I'd guessed closer to the truth than he wanted to admit. A week later, I found out how much closer. I drove back out to Journey Creek Lane to keep going through June's papers, and found Holt's truck already parked outside the cabin. The padlock had been cut clean off the door. He was standing at the desk, a folder of old documents in his hand, looking through them the way a man looks through something he's afraid of and can't stop reading anyway. "You broke the lock," I said. "I needed to see what was actually in here before you went telling people things you don't understand," he said. Not looking up. "Telling people what, exactly?" "That your father spent 40 years protecting his sister's memory, and you spent the same 40 years pretending she never existed?" That got him to look up. "You don't know what it was like," he said, sharper now. "You didn't grow up in that house, hearing Dad talk about respectability like it was the only thing keeping this family from falling apart. You don't know what it cost him to keep his mouth shut about June every single day of his life. And you definitely don't know what it'll cost the rest of us if this gets dragged out into the open now. That land's worth something now, on top of everything else," he added. "The county's been buying up parcels out this way for a new access road. If June's name is still attached to any old deed, that changes who that money is supposed to go to. And it's not going to a niece nobody in this family bothered raising. So this was never about protecting me from a hard truth," I said slowly. "It was about making sure I never found out there was money involved at all. It was about keeping a mess buried that never needed to come back up," he snapped. But his voice cracked in a way that told me he wasn't as certain of that as he wanted to sound. I asked him, straight out, why he'd told me Grandpa left me nothing, when Grandpa had clearly spent years quietly protecting this exact place for exactly this exact moment. He was quiet long enough that I thought he wasn't going to answer at all. Because our father spent 30 years telling me June's mistake was the reason this family had to work twice as hard to be respectable again, he finally said. I grew up believing that keeping this place buried was keeping the family safe. It wasn't until Dad got sick that he started talking about her like he regretted every year he went along with it. By then it felt too late to undo. So I just kept doing what I'd always done. He looked at the folder in his hands like it had betrayed him just by existing. I'm not proud of what I told you, he said. But I believed, for a long time, that I was protecting something worth protecting. It wasn't forgiveness, what passed between us in that cabin. But it was the first honest thing my uncle had said to me in my entire life. And it mattered more than I expected it to. I didn't take him to court over the lock, or the folder he'd tried to take. I told him, plainly, that I understood some of why he'd done what he did, even if I couldn't fully forgive it yet. I'd rather spend my energy building something out of what Grandpa left me than spend it fighting my own family in a courtroom. Driving away from the cabin that afternoon, I kept replaying the look on Holt's face when he said he wasn't proud of what he'd told me. I'd spent my whole life thinking of him as the flat, practical uncle who announced weather delays and settled estates over the phone without softening a single word. I hadn't considered, until that afternoon, that a man could spend 30 years believing a lie was protection, and only realize how wrong he'd been once the person he'd wronged was already gone. I didn't forgive him that day. I'm not sure I fully have, even now. But I stopped needing him to be simply cruel, the way I might have needed a few weeks earlier, back when nothing about my inheritance made sense yet and I needed somebody safe to be angry at. That conversation left me with a harder question than anything Holt had said out loud. If Grandpa had gone to this much trouble to protect June's memory from a man who'd spent 40 years pretending she never existed, what had he been protecting her memory for? Garrett came around only once, after word got out about June and the cabin. I was clearing brush from the front path on a Sunday afternoon when his truck pulled up the gravel drive. He didn't apologize. Not exactly. He stood near his truck with his hands in his pockets and said he supposed he owed me something for the way he'd laughed at me that first day. He said his dad, my aunt's husband, had been the one who told him the trailer was a joke worth making, and that he'd just gone along with it because everyone else did. I laughed because it was easier than thinking about it, he said, not quite looking at me. If nobody's ever said different, it's easy to believe someone doesn't matter much. He reached into his truck and pulled out an old crescent wrench, the handle worn smooth. Said he'd found it in his dad's garage years back, and it had Grandpa's initials scratched into the base. He didn't know why he'd kept it. He just thought it should be mine now. I appreciate you saying that, I told him. And I meant it. I didn't tell him it fixed anything, because it didn't. But I took the wrench, and I haven't seen him laugh at anyone since, and for Garrett, I've come to understand, that's about as much growth as I'm likely to get from him. I stood there afterward, watching his truck disappear down the road, and thought about how easy it had been for my whole family to decide, in a single afternoon, exactly what the trailer was worth. Exactly what I was worth. Exactly what June had been worth, decades before any of us were born. None of them had bothered to look twice. Grandpa was the only one who had. I thought about that 7-year-old standing outside a locked school building at dusk, waiting for a mother who'd forgotten to pick her up for the 3rd time that month. I thought about the old pickup pulling up, heater blasting, and the way he'd told me I never had to wonder whether someone was coming for me, as long as he was alive. I understood, standing on that gravel path, that he'd been keeping that exact promise to someone else, decades earlier. To a sister nobody else had bothered to remember. The rest of June's story came together slowly, over documents I read late into the night by lantern light, because the cabin still had no working electricity. June had died of pneumonia 11 years after being sent away. Alone. At the age of 29. Grandpa was the only family member present. According to the last letter in the stack, written in his own hand and addressed to no one in particular, as though he'd needed to write it just to survive writing it, he had promised her, at her bedside, that her name would not simply disappear the way the rest of the family wanted it to. He had kept that promise the only way he knew how. Quietly. for 4 decades. Maintaining a small parcel of land nobody else remembered, waiting for someone in the family who might understand why that mattered. He'd found that someone in me, he wrote, the year I turned 16 and told him I wanted to help people who'd been forgotten by everyone who was supposed to look out for them. He said he'd known then that I was the one who would understand what June's cabin actually meant. More than money ever could. I closed the letter and sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the wind move through the pines outside, thinking about how many years he must have carried her alone before he found someone to carry her with him. I thought about all the ordinary afternoons I'd spent with him growing up, never once suspecting any of this. Teaching me to change a tire in the driveway. Sitting through school plays my own mother missed. Every single one of those afternoons, some part of him had been driving out to this cabin on the weeks I didn't see him, keeping a promise to a sister the rest of the family had agreed to forget. He never once made me feel like I was competing with a ghost for his attention. He'd simply loved us both, in the 2 different ways each of us had needed it, and never let either love come at the other's expense. I didn't know, that night, whether I had it in me to carry what he'd carried. But I understood, for the first time since the phone call in the church parking lot, exactly what he'd been trying to teach me on that porch the spring I turned 18. Some people spend their whole lives proving they were worth remembering, simply because somebody finally showed up and remembered them first. The land itself, it turned out, wasn't the fortune Holt feared. A local attorney I eventually consulted, a calm and precise woman named Odessa Pruitt, spread the old deed and the trust paperwork across her desk and walked me through it the way you'd walk someone through directions to a place they'd never been. Your grandfather set this up carefully, she said, tapping a page near the bottom. He transferred the parcel into a small family trust 11 years ago, naming you as sole beneficiary once you turned 20. Well, before he passed. That means it was never part of his estate at all. Nothing your uncle or anyone else agreed to in probate touches this land. She looked up at me. As for the county road, I've seen the survey maps. It clips the northeast corner of the property. Nothing more. The compensation, if it happens at all, would likely be a few $1,000s. Enough to matter for repairs. Nothing close to what your uncle seems to have convinced himself was at stake. I asked her, plainly, whether June's name being on any of the old paperwork could complicate things further. Whether some forgotten cousin might someday have a claim I didn't understand. Legally, no, she said. The adoption was closed and finalized decades ago, and the trust names you specifically. Then, more gently, morally, that's a different question. And one only you can decide how to answer. I sat with that question for a long time after I left her office. Grandpa hadn't left me wealth. He'd left me responsibility. A parcel of land, a story nobody else had bothered to keep, and a choice about what to do with both. I thought about June's letter, the unfinished one, the one where she wondered whether being remembered by one person was enough to call a life worth living. I thought about myself, 3 weeks earlier, sitting on a curb behind a church with 2 grocery bags, wondering the same thing about my own life. I understood, finally, what Grandpa had actually given me. Not an answer. A chance to become one, for somebody else. Driving back out to Journey Creek Lane that evening, I passed the church parking lot where I'd sat on the curb 3 weeks earlier, everything I owned in 2 grocery bags. I almost didn't recognize the version of myself who'd been sitting there. Not because anything about my situation had gotten easier yet. The trailer still needed a real roof. The cabin still had no working electricity. I still didn't have a plan I could have explained to anyone without it sounding half-finished. But I wasn't empty-handed anymore. I had a road. A name. A promise somebody had kept for 40 years without ever once telling me about it. That was going to have to be enough to start with. I didn't do any of what came next to make a shrine out of my great-aunt's suffering. I did it because I understood, in a way I hadn't before finding that letter, what it felt like to have a family quietly decide you didn't count enough to keep. And I understood that the cabin and the trailer together were proof that at least one person in that family had refused to accept that verdict. Aunt Corinne came out to see the cabin about 6 months into the work that followed, mostly, I think, out of guilt over how quickly she'd written the trailer off as worthless. She stood in the doorway a long time, looking at June's photographs, before she said anything at all. "Nobody ever told me there was a sister," she said quietly. "I always just assumed Dad was an only child. I didn't have it in me to be angry at her for not knowing. She hadn't buried the truth. She'd simply never been given the chance to learn it. Same as I hadn't, until a broken trailer and a hollow floorboard gave me one." My mother called more often after that. Not because anything between us transformed overnight, but because word of what I'd found had apparently reached her too, and something about it shook loose a little more attention than I'd gotten from her in years. I didn't lean on that too hard. I'd learned not to build my sense of worth around whether my mother happened to be paying attention that month. But I let the calls come. And some weeks, that was enough. What I built, over the following year, wasn't complicated. I fixed the trailer first, since it was the smallest job, and the one I understood best after everything I'd already survived inside it. I patched the roof properly this time. Replaced the boarded window with real glass. Sanded and repainted the walls a warm, plain white, until the whole space felt less like something abandoned and more like something waiting. Then I turned to the cabin. Replaced the roof. Ran proper electricity for the first time in its history. Restored June's old desk instead of throwing it out. Kept her photographs on the same shelf where I'd found them. Dusted now. Finally seen. None of it happened as fast as I wanted it to. I didn't have money sitting around for a roof or new wiring. What the trust actually gave me was the land itself, free and clear, and a small maintenance fund Grandpa had built into it over the years. Enough to matter. Nowhere near enough to finish everything at once. I kept my job at the diner the whole first year, picking up every extra shift my manager would give me, driving out to Journey Creek Lane after closing to work by flashlight until I couldn't see straight anymore. Some weekends I made real progress. Other weekends I just sat on the cabin steps too tired to lift a hammer, wondering if I'd taken on more than one person could actually carry. Odessa helped me untangle the permit questions that came with turning an old family cabin into anything more than a private residence. County zoning wasn't built for what I wanted to do, and there were 3 separate meetings before anyone at the county office would even tell me which form I needed first. I didn't get everything right. I hired a roofer for the cabin who took a deposit and never came back, and I lost 6 weeks and $400 I didn't have to spare before I found someone else through a hardware store recommendation, the same store, as it happened, where Holt still worked the counter most mornings. He didn't say much when I came in asking. He just wrote down a name and a number on the back of a receipt and slid it across without meeting my eyes. It wasn't forgiveness. But it was something. There were nights that year I genuinely considered quitting. Nights the cabin felt less like a legacy and more like a second job I hadn't agreed to take, stacked on top of diner shifts and a car that needed brakes I kept putting off. What kept me going wasn't some grand sense of purpose. Most nights it was smaller than that. It was remembering the sound of the hollow floorboard under my feet that first week, and how close I'd come to never noticing it at all, too tired and too certain I had nothing left to find. Odessa checked in more than a lawyer probably needed to. Priscilla, before she'd even agreed to send anyone, spent an afternoon helping me figure out a fire escape route out of the cabin's one window that actually met code. Corrine started showing up on weekends with a cooler of sandwiches and didn't ask permission first. None of them owed me that. They gave it anyway, and somewhere in the middle of all those small unasked for kindnesses, the project stopped feeling like something I was building alone. That's what gave me the idea for what came next. I reached out to a shelter 2 towns over, one that worked with young people aging out of foster care or leaving unstable homes with nowhere else to go. The way I once had nowhere else to go. I asked whether they'd ever considered a small transitional space. Somewhere temporary and safe, while someone figured out their next real step. The woman who ran it, a no-nonsense caseworker named Priscilla Odom, drove out to see the property herself before she agreed to anything. She walked the whole lot twice, asking sharp, practical questions about plumbing and locks and how quickly someone could get into town for work. She left that first visit saying only that she'd think about it. I respected her enough not to push. She called back 3 weeks later. The first young man who stayed in the trailer was 19. Aging out of a group home, with a job lined up at the feed store and nowhere to sleep until his first paycheck cleared. He stayed 11 days. Thanked me twice as much as he needed to. Left a note on the counter I still have folded in a drawer. After him came a girl of 17, who needed somewhere quiet to finish her last semester of high school online after her foster placement fell through unexpectedly. She stayed in the cabin itself for 4 months. Some evenings she sat at June's old desk to do her homework. That felt, more than anything else I'd done to that place, like exactly what it had been waiting for. Priscilla told me once, sitting on the cabin porch with a clipboard balanced on her knee, that most of the kids who come through her office have heard some version of the same sentence I heard from Holt on the phone that afternoon behind the church. "There's nothing here for you." Different words, usually. Same verdict. She said what she'd learned, over 15 years of that work, was that the sentence itself rarely turned out to be true. It was just the version of the truth the people saying it found easiest to live with. I thought about Grandpa's letter every time she said something like that. I found the one thing in this family nobody thought was worth looking at twice. Maybe that's what all of it had actually been for. Not just June. Not just me. A place built specifically for the kind of person somebody else had already decided wasn't worth a second look. The trailer became the first of it. Small, plain, but warm and dry, locked from the inside for whoever needed it most on a given week. The cabin became something more permanent. A quiet place for someone to stay longer, while they got back on their feet. Exactly the kind of second chance nobody had offered June. And nobody had fully offered me either, until Grandpa found a way to leave one behind for both of us at once. I named the whole small project after her. Not after Grandpa, though he was the reason any of it existed, but after June. Because her name was the one my family had spent 40 years trying to make disappear, and I decided the best way to honor what Grandpa protected was to make sure it never disappeared again. I had a small sign made for the end of the gravel drive. Plain wood, hand-lettered. June's place. No explanation beneath it. The people who needed to understand what it meant would understand it without one. I found the last thing almost by accident, going through a box of Grandpa's old belongings my mother finally sent me that spring. An old cassette tape, unlabeled, at the bottom of a coffee can full of nails and spare hardware. I almost threw it out before I recognized his handwriting on a strip of masking tape stuck to the side. For Marlowe. Whenever you need it. It took me 2 days to find a player that still worked. His voice was rougher than I remembered, older than the version of him I kept in my head, recorded sometime in his last year, from the sound of it. Marlowe, if you're hearing this, I probably didn't say it enough while I still could, so I'm saying it now. A house is just a place to keep your things dry. A home is a place where somebody already decided, a long time before you got there, that you were worth showing up for. I couldn't give June that in time. I'm hoping I gave it to you early enough that it actually counts for something. Whatever you build with what I left you, build it for the ones nobody else thought to look for twice. That's the only inheritance that ever mattered in this family. It just took me too long to figure out how to leave it to somebody properly. I sat on the floor of the cabin and played it 3 times before I could make myself turn it off. It wasn't a long recording. Maybe 30 seconds. But it said more plainly than anything else he'd left me exactly what all of it had been for. Not the land. Not the trailer. Not even June's story, as much as that story mattered. The promise underneath all of it. That somebody had decided, long before I ever needed proof, that I mattered enough to build a life around. And that I got to decide the same thing, now, for whoever walked up that gravel drive next. Some nights, when a new arrival is settling into that trailer for their first uncertain evening in a place that isn't quite home yet, I sit outside on the same cinder blocks I once climbed with 2 grocery bags and nowhere left to go. I think about how close I came to believing my family was right that first week. That I had been left nothing. I think, too, about June, counting the days between her brother's visits in that same cabin, decades before I ever set foot in it, wondering whether being remembered by one person was enough to call a life worth living. I never got to ask her that question directly. But I like to believe that if she could see the gravel drive now, the lights on in the windows some nights, the sign at the end of the road bearing her name for anyone passing by to read, she'd understand that the answer, eventually, was yes. It just took longer than she got to live to see what that one person's stubbornness could grow into. Grandpa's letter never told me everything at once. It told me just enough to keep looking. He could have written it all down plainly that first day. I understand now why he didn't. Some truths only mean something once you've had to go looking for them yourself. I still have that first letter, folded inside the same metal box, kept now in a drawer in the cabin instead of hidden under a broken floor. I read it sometimes on hard nights, when a young person shows up on the porch with the same hollow, exhausted look I know I must have had myself once. "You found the one thing in this family nobody thought was worth looking at twice," he wrote. I always tell them the same thing Grandpa once told a scared 7-year-old standing outside a locked school building at dusk. You never have to wonder whether someone is coming for you. Not here. Not anymore. June's place isn't finished, and I've stopped expecting it ever will be. There's always another roof to patch, another intake call from Priscilla's office, another young person standing at the end of the drive with everything they own in whatever bag they managed to grab on the way out the door. Some stay 11 days. Some stay 4 months. A few send photos afterward, first apartments, first paychecks framed on a wall somewhere, the kind of ordinary milestone that would have meant nothing to me 2 years ago and means everything to me now. I think Grandpa knew, somehow, that the trailer he left me was never really about the trailer at all. It was about making sure that whatever I found first, on the worst night of my life, it wouldn't be nothing. Last week, a girl about the age June had been arrived after dark, soaked from the walk up the drive, asking in a small voice if this was really a place people could just stay. I played her grandpa's tape before I showed her the trailer. She sat very still through all of it, and when it ended, she just nodded, like she'd needed someone else's grandfather to say it before she could believe it applied to her too. You never have to wonder whether someone is coming for you. Not here. Not anymore.